Saints Row. This might come as a surprise to some, but it's actually one of my favorite franchises of all time. Now, part of that, of course, comes from, by extension, with me being an OG, or original, GTA fan, having owned basically all of the combination disc releases of that series. Saints Row on the surface has always been compared to GTA, but it's not GTA, it's something different, and that was the final puzzle piece that made me fall in love with it. Originally introduced to the series starting with the first game back in 2006, I instantly became a fan of Saints Row, a gang-focused open-world shooter that follows you, the boss, the main character, and of course, the eventual boss of the gang, the Saints. And purple is just such a great color. Now in the comments you can let me know what your favorite Saints Row was and why, whereas for me, it was the second game, Saints Row 2, a true sequel and true iteration on the first game that was literally better in every way. It also maintained a level of seriousness and believability that unfortunately would be abandoned with the Saints Row 3 DLC and finally the fourth entry into the series, which is often described more like a superhero game than a crime action adventure game shooter. After Saints Row 4, we would have the third game remastered, which made sense because it was the best-selling game, and, well, the easiest to remaster. But we wouldn't have another Saints Row title for a number of years. It seemed like the series had gone totally dormant, and then announced in 2021 coming the next year would be none other than another Saints Row entry, dubbed Saints Row 2022 by most, but unbeknownst to most, or at least at their behest, boy I feel like a 15th century poet, was that this new SR game was actually a full reboot. This means the beloved characters and story of the previous games would be discarded in favor of a retry, putting immense pressure on this new title. Saints Row 2022 would launch in August of 2022 and would ultimately be Disastrous. It would be the game's worst rated in the series critically, and nearly universally hated by the series' most hardcore fans. With sales that seemed to be less than the previous titles, reportedly even the first game, which sold over 2 million copies. With reports from both media and players alike aligning as they would describe quite a troubled and buggy game behind it all that failed to meet expectations on many fronts. Volition, the developer behind the Saints Row series since the beginning, would try to pull out all the stops to fix the game, but even after a dubbed relaunch of the game, things seemingly just wouldn't improve, and Volition would change masters before ultimately being shuttered altogether just 1 year later after launching Saints Row 2022. That means that the SRIP is on the shelf right now, and unless Embracer Group decides to field another new team for another SR game, we very likely won't see another Saints Row game. What went wrong with one of the biggest and most successful GTA competitors? How did they go from selling millions of copies to having their parent company shutter due to a lack of success with the same series? On this episode of Death of a Game, we will not just cover the Saints Row series that's recent, but also cover why the series in general has ended up in the state that it has, leading to Volition's shutdown. The Death of a Game series is a series specialized for just that, where we pick a game or company in the process of dying or dead outright, and try to investigate the largest contributing factors to that game's death. We do this by utilizing a timeline of events that are filled with clues, developer testimonies, player feedback, and of course, detective intuition coming mostly from me, your detective, bolstered of course by a legion of detectives who help power the research, and thus the channel. But this episode, it's a special one. Not just because I love the Saints Row series and still hope the best for it, so I have a bit of hope or delusion if you want to call it that, and depending on how you see it, but because this episode will also cover some of the backstory on the Saints Row series in general, adding to the investigation overall. I hope you are as excited as I am to crack this case, detectives. Don your purple, Saints, make yourself a waffle, and let's get to the case. The story begins quite far back actually, but we're gonna try to breeze through the timeline here at a faster pace than normal. Volition, originally known for the Descent and Free Space simulators, would be acquired by THQ as far back as August 2000, and this would immediately result in the development of more ambitious projects like the Red Faction series, and shortly after, Volition would request from its developers during a design exercise some new ideas and game demos to find the company's next direction. One of these such demos, which, while being played, featured a song that says that, you know, the classic NWA song, "Fuck the police coming back from the," was about a gang simulator that would later become what we know as Saints Row, the series, starting of course with the first game that launched back in 2006. Saints Row was not only the first game in the series, it was the introduction too of what would become a beloved cast of characters. Starting with Julius Little, the founder of the Saints gang, this is the gang the player is featured in. Johnny Gat, a favorite of many Saints Row fans, myself included, who is arguably one of the coolest Asians in gaming, and is basically like Kuwabara from Yu Yu Hakusho. The lovable brute. And of course more like Troy, Julius's second in command and a critical piece of the gang, or Dex, the more rational lieutenant. The second game would iterate more upon this, highlighting some of the same characters and introducing some more, like the beloved Lieutenant Pierce and mirroring the same serious tone of the previous game, where the plot was still the same concept, following the boss, aka you, operating in the Saints gang, until you would eventually become, well, the boss of it, which is what the second game is about, really. I don't want to spoil the plot of the second game because I still think it's the best in the series by far and still holds up, but eventually you become the real boss, and the third game is basically you reaping the benefits of what that is. The reason it's important to mention these previous games before getting back to progressing the timeline is because after the second game, Saints Row would actually start to have some pretty big shifts and changes in its approach. While Saints Row 3 is the best-selling game in the series and definitely a favorite of mine in co-op, it's also the biggest and likely most expensive, besides the one that we're covering now. The plot of the game reflects this, as it takes a rather grounded previous plot that had its fair share of goofy and silly moments, don't get me wrong, but was still rather believable and just upped the ante. The knobs were turned all the way up, and SR3 was really a game about being like John Wick, or Sam Fisher, or etc. While it was an enjoyable game even for myself included, having some of the most epic missions of the series, it was a sign that things were only going to seemingly get bigger for the series. That level of skill as a gang simulator was going to be pretty hard to manage. With the fourth game, we reportedly saw the worst sold game in the series yet, reasons largely being centered around how the game was kind of like a poor man's Crackdown, or just a superhero open world game. Now the Saints were fighting against like intergalactic aliens, which was hilarious, but was apparently originally meant to just be another DLC in the series for the third game. But it was so big they just made it into another game, according to demands from THQ. And this sort of tracks, when Gangstas in Space was already a pretty big departure for the series as a DLC for the third game, being basically a Mass Effect parody, with the fourth game building heavily more upon that. This game though, the fourth game in the series, would sell very poorly respectively, and was largely disliked by OG Saints Row fans, including myself. The problem was that now the Saints Row series was in a tough spot for two major reasons. First, storytelling and expectation-wise, the game had broken the scale of its world, and basically gone to a place that was going to be hard to bring it back down to Earth from, literally. When you go from shooting people with inaccurate but classic-feeling submachine guns and assault rifles to flying around and somersaulting through the air to kill aliens, it's just hard to bring the story back from such a thing. The second problem, and arguably even bigger one, was that the decade-long publisher of Volition was filing for bankruptcy, and would get their assets, Volition and Saints Row included, purchased by none other than a publisher a part of a super publisher group, Koch Media, now known as PlayOn. This Austrian media company would purchase Volition and Saints Row as a franchise, with clear intentions on continuing upon it. Leading the publishing on things from that point on, though, was Deep Silver, which was a publishing label underneath PlayOn. PlayOn, as I mentioned, was a subsidiary of a massive group. That group, Embracer Group, a Swedish video game company and media holding company who owns the likes of Crystal Dynamics, THQ Nordic, Dark Horse Media, and now Volition Games. A mega company boasting a whopping 7,800 employees and now owning a wide range of popular IPs and game companies. Sure, the Volition and Saints Row teams had the chance to make a new game, that was kind of good news, but things weren't gonna be the same with these new owners, as we have not only seen in the past, but would later learn from behind the scenes about the new Saints Row game. Detour Detectives, Volition in this process was actually working on another game before getting acquired, that would launch August 15th, 2017, dubbed Agents of Mayhem. Agents of Mayhem was actually a multiverse cross game between Saints Row and the Red Faction worlds. AOM was an open-world, mission-focused third-person action-adventure game, with 12 agents to choose from. Players didn't create their character in this game as in normal Saints Row games. Instead, this made the game play out more like a hero shooter. Difference being it was mission-focused, as I stated, playing sort of like The Division, or Ghost Recon Breakpoint, or let's just call it what it is, like a full Crackdown clone, whereas Saints Row 4 was kind of just more of the imitation still. But here's the absolute gut punch about this incredibly random game. It was only single player, something that hasn't even been true about Saints Row from the beginning of the game 10 years prior. This would actually catch me completely off guard whenever I would encounter Agents of Mayhem at E3 2017, as you can see from the footage on screen. Seeing a Volition game immediately caught my attention, and I was eager to find out what this new game was. Upon playing it, it felt indeed like a mixture of Red Faction and Saints Row, not feeling as Saints Row though as it probably looks. When I turned to my friend, also playing the game alongside me, I realized something. We were both playing our own separate games. I asked the developer standing there with me, hey, is this game just single player only? And he would look at me, pause for a second, and then say, yeah, but you can play between 3 different characters and agents at the same time. And I was just dumbfounded, and I couldn't even hide it. After my session ended, I pulled my friend to the side and said, just dead in the water. But Agents of Mayhem wouldn't just be a failure, it would be the biggest failure in Volition's history, only selling like 300,000 copies and directly leading to layoffs at the company. This put the company into a tough position. This was their first game with Deep Silver, their new publisher, and it was a massive failure. They likely couldn't survive another one. And it wouldn't be a death of a game case if I didn't have some tea. I was told that Agents of Mayhem was repurposed into the next Saints Row game, not just to save time, effort, and money, but to put their eggs into their most successful franchise basket. Sort of how they did with the SR3 DLC turned into SR4. And sorry, it's hard not to notice the similarities between Saints Row 2022 and, well, Agents of Mayhem when watching gameplay, even down to things like physics and animations. Gearing up for the new project would be the return of one of Volition's founders, Mike Kulas, as the GM, who was the studio head during Saints Row 1 and the GM on the second game. After both major writers, Steve Jaros and Drew Holmes, would leave for Valve and Ubisoft respectively, the previous studio design director Jason Scott, who had some writing credits back in the day, would assume the main writer role. But these were tough shoes to fill. Steve getting hired at Valve meant that he was surely talented, which is why he was actually pinned to be the main writer behind the third-person MOBA Deadlock. And of course, he was SR's main writer, now gone. The second most important writer, Drew Holmes, would go on to write Far Cry New Dawn, which had a rather interesting story as well. Besides these tough shoes to fill, Jason Scott hadn't written a successful game since Red Faction back in 2001, and seemingly had been an executive for well over a decade. I don't know what motivated Jason to take over things, but his involvement in things would be substantial to say the least. According to reports, during the development of the new Saints Row game, which at this time had not yet been announced, Jason Scott would, during a work time break period, rewrite the game's story from being the sequel, dubbed Saints Row 5, according to Mr. Saints Godzilla, who will actually be a recurring character throughout this case, to being a full-on reboot. That would mean that no previous Saints would be included, and the entire story of the first 4 games, especially the most impactful, which was the first 3, would be rewrote. According to the reports, Jason had pushed the game to a reboot, and while you can argue from the perspective that, well, they just had no choice because of the 4th game and how its story ended, Jason was never a writer on the previous Saints Row games anyway. So maybe this was more about like having a fresh start and approach at redoing the series himself? Or to throw them some bail, maybe just Deep Silver, their very involved publisher and now owner, suggested it and he just jumped at the idea or was just the one to execute things. This might seem conspiratorial, but us detectives can be that at times when facing little evidence. But according to some reports, including from Mr. Saints Godzilla themselves, Jason was pleased with the direction of the more superhero approach of the series, and the less gang-focused approach that the story took at the end, especially in Saints Row 2022. On August 25th, 2021, it would be let known publicly the intention of a new Saints Row project, a reboot, promised to launch the next year, February 2022. Saints Row 2022, as it was known, would be a full reboot of the series, including rewriting the entire backstory of the boss, you, the main character featured throughout, and even the main gang featured throughout, the Saints. Deep Silver Volition was steadfast in their decision to reboot the series despite having a bad reception from die-hard fans. But they didn't understand that fans weren't just mad about them not having the classic characters around anymore, they were mad about the seemingly new direction of the series as shown in the reveal trailer. Starting with Eli and his chipper voice as he calls his friend Kevin, Eli shows a glimpse of personality, sure, but comes across as a bit dorky, which is fine, this can work, as it's actually worked already in Saints Row before, but we will cover Eli and the other characters more in depth later. Kevin has his moment in the sun to drop a one-liner, like Johnny Gat would have, and just instead drops a snoozer. You're then introduced to a totally underwhelming character, Nina, who just basically explains everything like a narrator, somehow disinterested in the process of it all. And then it seems like Eli is not actually a combatant-type companion or crew member, and is seen being scared and surprised throughout most of the scenes. The boss then makes an appearance, dressed like a teenage punk rocker, and makes a proclamation to defend their friends. The delivery throughout is quite robotic and poor, and speaks to a total lack of the personality and character throughout the game, and well, just the flavor of the new cast of Saints. So to just dismiss the fan criticism as not wanting a reboot was, well, dismissive. when the issue wasn't just because it was a reboot, it was because they weren't sold yet on the new Saints that were supposed to replace the old loved ones. Just look at the comments. They're quite negative on the video itself, comparing the new cast of the Saints to like gentrified hipsters, or dorks that the first cast of Saints would have just bullied, which is probably true. Contrast this to the classic Saints Row trailer, which is all about showcasing the gang simulator aspects of the game, including the gang wars featured throughout. The simplicity of it is so beautiful, but it worked, and works. Note the color would later change from green to purple for the Saints from the gameplay you're seeing on screen, so enjoy this kind of like Easter egg footage. But the next range of trailers from Saints Row 1 and 2 would also feature these clear statements. These are games about gangsters who commit crimes. The newest Saints Row reveal looked like a group of teenagers from a tween film, who ended up having to commit some heist because otherwise their goldfish is gonna get blown up, or something. It just wasn't believable. It wasn't cool, and worst, it wasn't the Saints, and not Saints Row. The PC police, or the politically correct police, something that has been affecting gaming for decades and, more recently, had struck and neutered one of the greatest video game series ever. The supposed February 2022 launch would actually be delayed, now reportedly set for later in the year in the fall, August 2022. Deep Silver Volition was vowing to want to finish the game properly. Due to miscalculating some development aspects, due to the pandemic, they had to actually delay things. As we will find out later, it was probably better if they gave it more of a significant delay. IGN in their preview of the upcoming Saints Row game would be incredibly positive concerning it. Based on their hands-on experience, checks notes, watching 50 minutes of gameplay? Yeah, this was an article that was actually published. If you are a veteran, if you've played through one or all of the 4 previous games, it's going to be something for you to enjoy. Be that the traversal mechanics, the new things we've added, or a world that's more vibrant and unique than anything we've ever had in the past. In the major preview for the new game, it would be stated that the new players and vets alike could find something to enjoy in the new Saints Row game. A high point being mentioned being the new traversal mechanics, which allowed for fast travel. Boo. I don't even know why that's even like brag-worthy anyway, when these open world games are actually big upon experiencing the open world and thus traversing it. Volition would brag about big customization, but clearly not even mention if it was bigger than the previous SR games. There were some signs. Sure, the game was delayed, but things like this and the fact that there was no playable beta, or most of the gameplay revealed was heavily curated, was kind of suspicious. But even with these clues, I don't think any of us could have expected the game's launch reception. Saints Row 2022 would launch worldwide August 23rd, 2022, on all platforms minus the Nintendo ones. Launching with cross-platform play and a full co-op campaign, Saints Row 2022 was Deep Silver Volition's chance to reignite the passion for their faltering series, and instead it torched whatever was left. Saints Row on aggregate review website Metacritic would score only a 61 out of 100 from a whopping 63 critics, and a diabolically low user rating of 3 out of 10. This would make it the lowest scoring Saints Row game in the franchise, scoring a whole 10 points lower than the lowest ranked game before that, Saints Row 4. IGN, who would rate the game a 6 out of 10, would state in their review that Saints Row delivers on the shallow shoot-'em-up thrills, but is very familiar and just uninspired. There aren't many high-profile full reviews for the project, despite the high amount of reviews for Saints Row 2022. Instead, I think it will be much more useful if we dive into some of the reasons that Saints Row 2022 had fallen short, and was failing both to impress both new and old fans. While Saints Row 2022 had good customization as they bragged about, it felt worse than the third game in the series. The new region and town, Santo Alesso, is kind of like Las Vegas, with more desert in it. It's actually a pretty cool location and city, I should mention. The issue being that it lacks like map interiors, which makes it feel pretty plastic and more like a set designed for a show. Alongside this new poor look at times would be the new visuals and art style of the game, which could have worked as like a spin-off Borderlands title, which is not necessarily inherently bad, but who wanted Saints Row to turn into like Borderlands? But how was this really an upgrade in any way, even as a reboot, which was going to be the expectation, right? I mean, you had T-posing glitches throughout the game, enemies having suddenly become massive bullet sponges, most of the healing done by committing takedowns, the NPCs feeling lifeless and just quite harmless, really. The NPCs in gameplay felt like it was back from 2005 or 2006, and meanwhile you couldn't even replay any of the missions and would receive only 2 enterable cribs. What was there in Saints Row 2022 was less than even like the first game in many ways, and worse, the whole flavor of the series had been lost. As we already talked about the new Saints cast kind of failing to impress, the Saints Row 2022 story was no different, a vapid and clearly feel-good type story. But here's the thing, the Saints Row series was never about that. The first 3 games start with you committing illegal crimes. Hell, Johnny Gat ends up burying a guy alive, just because he bothers his sister. The series was never overly dark, like grimdark, but it had its moments that reminded people that things weren't exactly sweet. You weren't playing the good guys, you were the bad guys, and that was kind of what made the series so special. Now you were a college fraternity of less popular characters or people who had little obvious reasons to be working together, besides just sharing rent and little chemistry as well. These characters are just boring. Down to how they look, check out the first game's cast by comparison. You can kind of tell what each character does or is like just based on how they look. Troy is a bit of the straight shooter, yet looks like the main character in Training Day, which might not be a coincidence because that character also coincidentally betrays the guy he works with. Then you've got Johnny Gat. Johnny Gat is just Johnny Gat. He just oozes coolness. Julius Little looks like he's obviously the one in charge while not looking to try hard in the process. Swap over to the new Saints and Eli is the business planner and strategist, so is that the bow tie that communicates that? He looks like a nerdy guy who gives you advice on special missions only. And then Kevin is supposed to be the actual fixer, but he looks more like a fixer-upper. And Nina might be one of the most boring characters they've introduced. Look, I've already spoken about this in previous videos, but it has to be stated again and clarified. Just like in this game, these characters sucking has nothing to do with DEI or woke culture. Instead, you have meddling from a publisher who has no idea what they were working with and no prior experience working with it, and Deep Silver. The thought was more about being politically correct to sell to the masses a deeply idiotic thing for such a controversial series that sold millions by being controversial. This likely led to the hodgepodge of lukewarm characters that were featured throughout, as meant to not offend anybody. This is ultimately the worst problem with the new Saints Row game. Sure, it was mid on many gameplay aspects, but the game was completely unoffensive, and instead of making you feel like a total badass, bad guy or not, you felt like the manager. Saints Row would falter, facing an enormous amount of backlash for its new bland characters, but more the fact that the game was incredibly buggy and borderline unplayable for some people. Saints Row 2022 was supposed to feel like a return to the Saints, but not a return to the gameplay of the first game, and arguably a worse one in my opinion because it feels even more arcadey in this game. Saints Row was never known as being the cleanest of the games. Its jank and wackiness was kind of part of the charm, especially up against GTA and Rockstar. But Saints Row 2022 felt like a community project in the Saints Row universe, more than a proper Saints Row game. Saints Row would receive a huge update, essentially packaged as a relaunch of sorts, bringing over 200 or so bug fixes, with improvements to quality of life, combat, and stability improvements too. This was supposed to bring the game to a playable state and remove most of the bugs within it, and I think that it largely succeeded at that. Problem is that, and this is the worst thing I can say regarding this, is that having tested it more recently, the game just still doesn't feel good. It's not what you would expect from a Saints Row game, especially a newer one, and the update thus was helpful to get the game to a better state, but not what this broken game needed to stay afloat. Deep Silver Volition just a month or two later, however, would cease to exist in name, being shifted from Embracer Group to Gearbox instead, November 17th, 2023. This was because, according to Embracer CEO Lars Wingefors, Volition had failed to impress with the new Saints Row game and were failing to meet expectations while leaving the fanbase polarized in the process. Lars would also state that they had expected more for the game and were still optimistic enough at their first financial quarter with the game. But Saints Row 2022 wasn't able to just float by with a lukewarm response. The game costed, reportedly, the same amount as Baldur's Gate 3, which cost around $100 million. Problem being, well, that game sold 15 million copies, making close to easily $500 million in the process. The two just weren't equal, and the investment in SR 2022 just wasn't financially feasible, and it led to a major loss for Embracer Group. But they were still vowing, even after Volition's shift, to not give up on the game yet, which they would sort of follow through with, going through with a paid DLC, the first of which, dubbed Heist in the Hazardous, This would introduce the wingsuit into the game and is kind of called like the wingsuit DLC, but it also had some new missions too. But it clocked in at like barely 2 hours of gameplay and is really just rewarding you with the new wingsuit, some new outfits, and a new safe house. All of this for about $5 though USD wasn't really that bad, but you can kind of tell when corporations make developers stick to games as a service type business plans, because even when the game starts to have a poor reception at launch, they still seem to carry on with the same DLC plans regardless, with no free or new incentives to account for their failure. Another DLC would drop Doc Ketchum's Murder Circus, a roguelite dungeon DLC of sorts that would score a whopping 38% score. This was due to its similarity to the Genki Bowl DLC from SR3. The fact that it was also single player only, and the fact that you couldn't play as your own boss, aka your own character. You had to play as like one of these like 4 random characters. This and the fact that the island located in the DLC is already in the game just makes it feel totally disconnected from everything, and just like a poor rehash of older stuff, yet done worse. The next DLC is easily the game's best DLC, scoring a positive rating for like the first time, and being loved due to the fact that it was actually different and, well, unique. It felt controversial, and it progressed the story, or at least built upon it. This was kind of like the LARP mission from the game built into a full DLC, the difference being that, well, more time and effort was put into this DLC, making it play out much better than the LARP mission did, which is actually a mission that's pretty disliked in Saints Row 2022. This DLC showed there was some talent in the rough, but one successful DLC wasn't going to be enough to fix the game, especially when the damage had already been done. They wiped the slate, and this is what we had now. There was no fixing this. It had to be built upon again, iterated in a way that was significant and would make the characters likable somehow. This is likely why the next decision was ultimately made, a sad and significant one, but perhaps one that needed to happen. Volition would be shut down. August 31st, 2024, a video game company that had been running for over 32 years. Anytime a longtime developer has to be shuttered, it's tragic, especially when they handled a few popular IPs that many gamers now watching were familiar with, like Red Faction and of course Saints Row. But Volition is not a normal case, reportedly, with past development, had already had a history of exceeding budgets, losing top talent, and having to expand their team size to make up for mistakes in production. And according to Saber Interactive founder Matthew Karch, Volition was just too expensive and had no idea what they were building, which would be sort of confirmed later on. Saints Row fans were understandably worried. With Volition gone, the Saints Row IP was on the shelf, on the fritz. No promises of any new titles coming, nor do fans, myself included, know if we could even trust any of those new titles to come. Speaking of Saints Row 2022 not performing well, or feeling like a proper SR title, while the game sold reportedly around like 1.7 million copies, that's actually less than the first 3 SR games and maybe even the 4th game. But investigating the development team, I found some more clues concerning why Saints Row 2022 didn't do so well. Jim Boone, who had his face and hands on many aspects in the game, was the game's chief creative officer, a former producer. Uh-oh. You know how I feel about producers turned developers or creatives. Gross. Having worked in business workshops, the last person that I would go to for ideas or design would be the marketer, which is basically what a producer is. Well, maybe they have a full business degree or some shit. But Boone was one of the loudest voices on Saints Row 2022, both privately and publicly. But we have some more questionable moves for the development team, like moving their artist Brian Traficanti to being a project creative director, which would actually reportedly have some negative consequences, as we will discuss shortly. Jeremy Bernstein, the lead mission narrative designer who seems to have a rather meh career besides this, in terms of relevant or critical experience, was the developer behind the abhorrent quote, "We created a cast of characters that you could invite into your living room." What? I like Johnny Gat, but no way am I letting him chill in my living room. He's a criminal and impulsive enough to like fight somebody at my flat. Such quotes just show how much of the essence of SR was just missing. A gang simulator. That essence had been lost. We take the talented Brian Dillo, who was the lead gameplay designer for the SR series in general, and we make him just the mission's design lead? And why do we have a lead project manager with no serious development experience? The final nail example I have to show just how much corporate bloat was involved in Deep Silver Volition is just Robert Luftus, who went from being an EP on a series that sold like 250,000 copies to now one that sold multiple millions? What an upgrade. The reason I mention these developers will make more sense in a second, because a prominent SR community member who had a behind-the-scenes look and testing of the game would bring to light many things. But where was Michael Sloan, Eric Rounds, gameplay designers on SR2, or Alan Lawrence? There were some good developers that were still around working on things, like Frank Marquardt, the art director of the game. or Dave Bianchi, who was the system's designer. And of course, one of the biggest names on the roster and recognizable voices and faces amongst like SR fans in general is Kate Marlin Nelson, who was a lead producer on the project too. Kate would later go on to work as a senior producer on God of War Ragnarok. The most talented devs at Volition were talented. And that's why when they would leave, they always had such important projects that followed. This shows a difficulty in the company keeping their talent when this talent is immediately making an impact elsewhere. But sometimes a few people in just some key positions can mess up a project even if there is talent involved, especially when the new publisher is not going to run things like the previous one and keeps putting their hand in the basket. Enter Mr. Saint's Godzilla 21, a legendary figure in the SR community and one who is a bit of an enigma. About a year ago, Mr. Saints talked about wanting to drop some serious information on the new SR release that was like NDA related. It felt and sounded ominous, and many people wrote them off for a while. And then, suddenly, Mr. Saints would drop this new expose YouTube video and the whole internet would just catch fire. I recommend watching Mr. Saints' video separately because it features a ton of details and interesting commentary from the SROG himself. But the main crux of the video is the fact that Saints Row 2022, or at least the one that we got, wasn't the one that Mr. Saints had played. According to Mr. Saints, Saints Row 2022 was originally supposed to be a sequel and involved the beloved original Saints characters, which was confirmed with the voice files from Pierce's voice actor, Arif Kenshin, surfacing. Saints Row 5, as I already mentioned it was dubbed, was supposed to be a continuation of the series and not a reboot. Early on, you would even rescue Pierce in the opening missions. These characters, the original Saints, as we already know though, would be later removed in favor of doing all new characters, without reasons really being given as to why. But we can certainly speculate it was related to the censorship that the game was receiving. But that's not the only thing that changed. Alongside the character changes would be an art style change too. While these early Saints Row 2022 screenshots showcase a more serious and less Borderlands tone, and honestly look quite good, this was not ultimately the art style that would be implemented. Many things like this and also the classic gang approach of Saints Row would be affected reportedly by Deep Silver themselves, the new publisher. Deep Silver didn't really seem to enjoy the serious tone of the content and seemed to urge Volition constantly to censor aspects of the game or at least just mute them. That's why the game feels like it's trying not to hurt anybody's feelings despite like the subject matter.
One guard out front and the owner at the till. He's a real scuzzbag. I want some king a dog. So, fuck that guy.
Which was never how the series felt before that.
Please. Kill me, but don't do this. Just kill me, damn it.
Examples of this are how you're not allowed to call characters in the game a bitch. Instead, they put in this whole bull testy rant into the game instead, for some reason.
Big, giant, sweaty horse balls.
Deep Silver straight up cutting the R-rated content and more classic Saints Row feel was just bizarre. This is a rare instance where we have reports of a publisher so directly meddling in a game so destructively, but it makes the story of Saints Row that much more tragic. This is an M-rated game that was being neutered from above and within. So not only was the dialogue being affected negatively, the writers weren't even allowed to attend voice acting sessions to witness and supervise the said dialogue. This is probably why the characters sound so out of touch and so often in the game. This was because, according to Mr. Saints, two producers were feuding with each other. Great. But wait, there's more. Brian Travacanti, who I mentioned previously due to his previous history as an artist, would actually be the one to push the game's direction into focusing on making it look more breathtaking, having zones divided up to achieve this very goal. Other devs would actually state that this focus, though, was a detriment to the game. That's because typically with an open world, you want to focus on building interactables that are fun and in the process build the visual staging around that, like Red Dead Redemption. Instead, you have the formula flipped here. And this is a video game after all. Compare the beginning of Saints Row 2022 to the first or second game's beginning. The start of Saints Row 1 is super engrossing and establishes the concept behind the whole game right away. It also communicates the theme and vibe. This is a crime-ridden world full of opportunity and you're just trying to survive it. You literally almost die and then get rescued by the Saints, which then helps you develop your relationship with them in just minutes into the game. Julius then welcomes you in like a father figure and Johnny's like that bro that you always wish that you had. He's threatening, but he's a good listener, and that makes him likable right away. The second game starts with you escaping the hospital with the help of some of the saints that you are now a part of the same gang with. You then literally murder a doctor, an innocent one, and then compare this to the beginning of Saints Row 2022, which just makes no sense to me. You're a part of the Martial Defense Industries, aka like the private military, which is not a bad idea, but then you go back home after work, which you then do for like 6 more missions by the way, in which you're like this super action hero for some non-described reason. And it turns out that you're just focused on making money, and your friends are, setting up to commit crimes? Why does no one seem to really care that you're working for the bad guys? Worse, before any of this is shown, there was a quick flash to the future forward cutscene that already shows you having won everything. Mansion, party, you name it, removing any of the tension from the game immediately, and well, kind of like the enjoyment of being able to build that up. Why not just start things like Firefly did it, make all of you the part of a military unit, but then just get disillusioned from things? That would have made a lot more sense and made you like your friends and interact with them at work and in the game right away. This version of the game was supposed to have so much more. APB level character customization, proclamations, territory control with criminal ventures being expanded into them, and yet none of this came to be. Instead, we got a game without anything innovative in it, that had been already drained like an orange of all the juice that made the game so great. Saints Row without the Saints, and without what made the series so lovable. This was a team of 230 developers right before launch, and yet is more of an example of how much poor leadership, ego battles, and a new militant publisher can just harm your game's development. Saints Row might not have been best destined for a reboot anyway, and if so, perhaps keeping the original Saints in that process wouldn't have been a bad idea and could have been on the table, but the reboot was what we got, and the problem being it just wasn't very good. When I play through a Saints Row game, I love experiencing this mixture of silliness, video game gangster gameplay, and this idea of acquiring more power to, feed the homies. With Saints Row 2022, I don't relate to or like any of the Saints, and the concept of gangs has basically been switched to more like a founded family situation, meaning that like the classic gangster gameplay was really gone. That was the pitch the whole game was sold on in the first place. Now, according to reports, Jason Scott preferred the less serious tone and hated comparisons to the GTA series in general. But the truth is, no one expected SR to ever be the GTA series, and I'm a massive fan of both. They tickled different itches and satisfied different palates. But make no mistake, SR of course was built on the foundation of GTA as an idea. And yet Saints Row 2022 felt more like a mixture of like the Borderlands games and like The Division, than a proper Saints Row game. The music is playing detectives, and this case has come to an end. Volition is gone, sad face, and Saints Row as an IP might still exist, but its future is looking even more bleak by the minute, as it will likely sit on the shelf until someone manages to buy it again, if they can, or do. But Saints Row 2022 was the worst commercially received game for Volition in the series yet, and was ultimately unrecoverable. In case you missed any of the clues along the way of the timeline unfolding, why did Saints Row 2022 fail and lead to Volition, the company behind the series, themselves dying? It doesn't feel like a proper Saints Row title. Ego battles amongst executives. It felt regressive even as a reboot. Poor development management and a usage of their resources. A buggy, bullet-sponged mess. Publisher Deep Silver's PC meddling really hurt development. With the timeline coming to an end and things having been deduced, we're seconds away from calling the curtains, detectives. But I have to say, as a longtime SR fan, I'm sad that this is the current state of the series. While there's always a chance for something to happen, it feels like we won't be getting back the essence that made SR, well, SR. Luckily, you can still play pretty much all of the Saints Row games, including online, though the first two require some matchmaking software as well. Something I recommend doing before that might no longer be the case. Yeah, I'm even talking about 2022, which also has full co-op. Thanks for watching this video, and detectives, thanks for your work on this case. If you thought I missed anything, let me know in the comments below, as well as what you want me to cover next. Enjoy this clue for the next case.